In 1872, a fully intact ship was found drifting aimlessly in the middle of the vast, unforgiving Atlantic Ocean. The sails were partially set. The cargo of 1,700 barrels was almost entirely untouched. 6 months' worth of food and fresh water sat quietly in the galley. Below deck, the crew's personal belongings, their clothes, their pipes, and even their life savings were still sitting in their chests. But the ship was completely, utterly empty. 10 people, including a veteran captain, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter, had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no blood, no struggle, and absolutely no explanation. What archaeologists, maritime historians, and scientists eventually uncovered about those final, terrifying moments on board shocked the world. But what is even more chilling is the single, terrifying detail that history books almost always leave out. Imagine being in the ocean, 1,000 miles from the nearest piece of solid ground. The year is 1872. There are no radios. There is no GPS. There are no D radios, helper cheese, waiting on standby. If something goes wrong out here, you are entirely on your own. This was the reality for the crew of the Mary Celeste, a massive 282-ton half-brig sailing vessel that departed from Pier 50 in New York City's East River on November 7. Their destination was Genoa, Italy. It should have been a routine, profitable voyage. The captain, Benjamin Briggs, was a highly respected, deeply religious man with a reputation for extreme caution. He was not a man who took risks. He was a man who had spent his entire life mastering the sea. And yet, less than a month later, his ship would become the greatest unsolved mystery in the history of human navigation. Why does this matter today? Because despite all of our modern satellite technology, our deep-sea submersibles, and our advanced forensic science, the ocean still holds secrets that can swallow a human life without leaving a single trace. Captain Briggs was accompanied by his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. He had hand-picked his crew, selecting 7 experienced, trustworthy sailors. They were men of good character, not the type to mutiny or cause trouble. The ship itself was freshly repaired, seaworthy, and loaded with a very specific, very volatile cargo. Precisely 1,701 barrels of highly concentrated, poisonous industrial alcohol. For the first 2 weeks, the voyage seemed perfectly normal. We know this because the ship's logbook documented their daily progress, noting the wind, the weather, and their coordinates. Everything was routine. Everything was exactly as it should be. But then, something strange happened. On December 5, roughly midway between the Azores and the coast of Portugal, another British-American ship named the Dei Gratia was cutting through the waves. Its captain, David Morehouse, was actually a personal friend of Benjamin Briggs. The two men had even dined together in New York the night before the Mary Celeste set sail. As Captain Morehouse scanned the horizon with his brass spyglass, he spotted a vessel about 5 miles away, moving erratically. It was yawing wildly in the wind, its sails flapping in a chaotic, uncontrolled manner. As they drew closer, Morehouse recognized the silhouette. It was the Mary Celeste. He ordered his men to signal the ship. No response. He hoisted the distress flags. Nothing. The ship was completely silent, moving like a ghost upon the water. History books don't always mention the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over the crew of the Dei Gratia that day. The ocean was quiet. The weather was calm. But the silence coming from the Mary Celeste was deafening. Captain Morehouse ordered his chief mate, Oliver DeVoe, to take a small boat and board the drifting vessel. As DeVoe and his men climbed over the wooden rails, their boots hit the deck with a hollow thud. They called out. No one answered. Step by cautious step, they moved through the ship. The silence was unnerving. The ship's single lifeboat was missing. But the ship itself was in perfectly sailable condition. Yes, there was about 3.5 feet of water in the hold, but for a ship of this size, that was a minor leak, easily manageable with the onboard pumps. It was absolutely no reason to abandon ship. But as Oliver DeVoe ventured further down into the captain's cabin, the mystery deepened. The captain's bed was unmade. A child's toys were scattered on the wooden floor. Sarah Briggs' rosewood melodeon, a type of small organ, sat quietly in the corner. In the galley, breakfast had been prepared. The ship's daily logbook lay open on the mate's desk. The final entry was dated November 24th at 8 in the morning. It simply noted their coordinates. Nothing more. No mention of storms, no mention of panic, no mention of danger. According to the logbook, they had been sailing perfectly normally. But that was 11 days ago. For 11 days, this 200-ton ghost ship had been sailing itself across the Atlantic Ocean. This is where the story stops making sense. Why would a seasoned veteran captain like Benjamin Briggs take his beloved wife, his infant daughter, and his entire crew and order them into a tiny, fragile wooden lifeboat in the middle of the open ocean? Leaving behind a perfectly good, fully stocked ship? It goes against every single rule of survival at sea. You never, ever abandon a floating vessel unless it is actively sinking beneath your feet. The Mary Celeste was not sinking. So what terrified them enough to flee? There are three major theories that have plagued historians for over a century. The first and most dramatic is the theory of foul play, mutiny, or piracy. But the evidence immediately destroys this idea. When investigators checked the cargo, the highly valuable barrels of alcohol were still there. Pirates would have stolen it. Furthermore, the crew's personal lockboxes, filled with their wages and valuables, were completely untouched. There were no signs of struggle. No broken doors, no shattered glass, no bullet holes. A few drops of what looked like blood were found on the deck, but later chemical analysis proved it was just rust. So if it wasn't pirates, and it wasn't a mutiny, what forced them off the ship? Theory number 2 suggests a terrifying natural phenomenon, a seaquake. A violent, sudden earthquake on the ocean floor could have sent a massive shock wave up to the surface, violently shaking the Mary Celeste. Some historians believe this shaking could have temporarily opened the seams of the wooden hull, allowing water to rush in quickly. Panicked by the sudden flooding and believing the ship was going down in minutes, Captain Briggs might have ordered an immediate evacuation. But that is not the whole story. While a sea quake is possible, it doesn't explain why the main hatch was found completely removed and left resting upside down on the deck. Why would you take the time to unseal the massive heavy wooden hatch covers if you were in a blind panic fleeing a sinking ship? And what they discovered next changes everything. When the cargo of industrial alcohol was finally unloaded in Italy months later, inspectors made a startling discovery. Out of the 1,701 barrels, that goodly, exactly 9 were completely empty. And these 9 barrels were made of red oak, unlike the others, which were made of white oak. Red oak is far more porous. It allows liquids and gases to seep through the wood. This single detail led to the most scientifically supported, and perhaps the most terrifying, theory of all. Imagine you are Captain Briggs. You have been sailing for over 2 weeks with a cargo hold full of concentrated, highly flammable alcohol. The ship hits rough weather and the porous red oak barrels begin to leak. The heavy, invisible vapor of the alcohol begins to fill the dark, enclosed space of the cargo hold. On the morning of November 24th, someone goes down to inspect the cargo, perhaps the ship's cook or the first mate. As they lift the heavy wooden hatch cover, the rush of fresh oxygen mixes with the concentrated alcohol vapor, and then, a spark. Maybe 2 barrels rubbed together in the rolling waves. Maybe someone had a lit pipe. What happens next is known as a pressure wave explosion. It is a massive, violent wall of fire that burns so fast it doesn't even have time to scorch the wood. It simply blows the hatch cover straight up into the air and sends a terrifying pillar of blue flame shooting out of the deck. Modern scientists have actually recreated this exact scenario in a replica ship hold, butane gas and paper. The explosion is violent, deafening, and completely terrifying, yet it leaves the paper completely unburned. Put yourself in Captain Briggs' shoes in that exact fraction of a second. A massive pillar of fire has just erupted from the belly of your ship. You are carrying 1,700 barrels of highly explosive liquid. You instantly believe the entire ship is about to detonate like a massive bomb, turning your family and your crew into ash. You don't have time to think. You don't have time to grab your life savings. You don't have time to pack extra food. Survival instinct takes over. You scream the order, abandon ship. The crew scrambles. They lower the small yawl boat into the churning ocean water. Briggs, his wife clutching the baby, and the 7 men pile into the tiny craft. But Briggs is smart. He doesn't want to just drift away. He wants to stay attached to the Mary Celeste, waiting to see if the ship actually explodes. If it doesn't, they can climb back aboard. So he grabs the main peak halyard along, incredibly strong rope used to hoist the sails, and ties it to the small lifeboat. They are now being towed behind the massive ship, maintaining a safe distance from the expected explosion. For a few minutes, they sit in the freezing spray of the Atlantic, their hearts pounding in their chests, watching the Mary Celeste cut through the water. They wait for the fire. They wait for the blast. But nothing happens. The initial vapor flash has burned itself out. The ship is safe. The danger has passed. A wave of immense relief must have washed over the captain. They survived. All they have to do now is pull themselves hand over hand along the thick rope, climb back aboard, and continue their journey. But even today, historians still cannot explain one final detail. The most heartbreaking, devastating piece of evidence found by the men of the Dei Gratia when they boarded the ghost ship, hanging off the back of the Mary Celeste, trailing far down into the dark, freezing water, was the main peak halyard, the thick, heavy rope. But it wasn't attached to anything. It was heavily frayed, and at the very end, it was violently snapped. In that crucial moment, as the small lifeboat was being towed behind the massive, unscrewed sailing ship, the wind suddenly changed. A massive, sudden gale caught the sails of the Mary Celeste. The 200-ton ship violently surged forward with the power of the open ocean. The immense, sudden force was too much for the rope. With a sickening, cracking sound that must have echoed like a gunshot, the towline snapped. In an instant, the lifeboat was disconnected. The crew, the captain, the mother, and the child watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as their massive ship, their only source of food, water, and survival, suddenly accelerated, sailing away from them at an incredible speed. The men in the tiny, wooden boat would have rowed frantically, screaming until their throats bled, their oars desperately cutting the water. But it was useless. You cannot outrow a fully rigged ship caught in a strong wind. They watched their salvation shrink into a tiny speck on the horizon, until it disappeared completely, leaving 10 souls bobbing in a fragile, wooden shell in the middle of a vast, merciless, and empty ocean. They had no water. They had no food. They had no shelter from the freezing night or the burning sun. What happened to them in those final days, drifting slowly toward madness and starvation beneath the endless sky, is a horror known only to the Atlantic. Their bodies were never found. Not a single piece of the lifeboat ever washed ashore. The ocean swallowed them whole, keeping their final moments a secret for all of eternity. The Mary Celeste was salvaged, brought back to port, and put on trial. The British authorities were convinced there was a massive insurance fraud conspiracy. They accused the salvagers of murdering the crew. They spent months trying to find hidden motives, secret plots, and dark betrayals. But they found nothing.